So about a month ago, I did a video on why Sony should be afraid of Microsoft, given that Microsoft just recently purchased 7 new studios within the last year. And quite honestly, I still feel that way. That shows their level of commitment to the games industry and their place in it. I think Sony as a company should be closely watching what Microsoft does based off that previous year of events. And of course, many of you responded to that video with either irrational or rational opinions. There was a lot of good discussion going on, but it certainly came about as though I'm stirring the pot, and I try not to do that. I try to have objective conversations, but like the consensus there was, how could you possibly think that? It should be the other way around. Microsoft should be afraid of Sony because Sony is such a giant in the games industry. They have those worldwide developers, the PS4 success, and that's why I didn't do a video like that. That seemed somewhat obvious to me. That's why I thought it was more interesting to talk about how Microsoft is very committed to the games industry now based off that previous year. So, at the very least, I think we could at least also do this video as sort of an even playing field here, but also we can talk a little bit about what we can expect for PlayStation 5 in the first year to 2 years, and also, very much so, why Microsoft should be afraid of Sony's continued dominance in the games industry. And as always, I wish it would go without saying, but I do try to stay as objective as possible when it comes to topics like these. You're just getting my honest opinion, you're getting as many facts as possible in relation to the topic at hand, the history of whatever's going on. Certainly, I try to stay as objective as possible. So I try to avoid the fanboy nonsense. So we're all adults here, let's try and keep it like that. If you are a young kid, here's some honest advice. Take the emotion out of it, don't get so worked up, they're just video game consoles, and we'll try to promote some healthy discussion. Now to get right into it though, it seems quite obvious. Sony has a suite of worldwide developers, and time again, Sony does extremely well with all of these games. These developers are consistently raising the bar for Sony's games in the video game industry. I mean, you don't even have to really discuss it, right? You can rattle it off. Horizon, God of War, you got Dreams coming next year, The Last of Us Part 2, all these other, I can't even rattle them off, right? There's so many PlayStation games, PS4's continued dominance, PlayStation 3 caught up to the Xbox 360, PlayStation 2 is the #1 home console worldwide, PlayStation did incredibly well, took Dreamcast completely off the market, right? These things go without saying, I feel. But just for an additional note to that previous video, what you have to understand is that I wasn't necessarily saying that Sony should be afraid of those 7 developers specifically, but more so the fact that purchasing 7 developers within a year's time is a very aggressive approach to bettering Xbox. So not necessarily the 7 developers exactly, because that's kind of where it all came to, is like, oh, Sony's developers are clearly much better and have a higher pedigree than those other 7 developers. And I certainly agree with that sentiment, but what I'm saying is that purchasing 7 developers in a year is very aggressive behavior. So if they're able to do that in a year, who knows what they're willing to do in the next 1 to 2 years. It shows that Microsoft is very committed to staying in the games industry and making it work. So that's really what I was more or less trying to get at. But when we look at the Sony side of things and get to the main bulk topic of this video, what you have to understand is that the timetable right now, as it stands, is a little bit off in terms of Sony's developers. Now, it's not entirely off, but many of Sony's developers are still working on PlayStation 4 games. Well, really, their last PlayStation 4 games. Naughty Dog, Media Molecule, Sony Ben, Sucker Punch, and Pixel Opus, they all still have games to release. So even if we see PS5 announced later this year and then released in 2020, there's just zero chance we'd see any games from these developers on PS5 until the PS5's second year on the market at minimum. Now that's not to say that's a problem. Sony does need to level out their releases and make sure that there's a consistent year-over-year release of quality titles, so that's certainly a good thing, but just don't expect PlayStation 5 games from those developers up until possibly 2 years of PS5 being on the market. However, what we can speculate on is developers that have already wrapped up PS4 games within the last year to 2 years previously and understand what we might be able to expect in the PS5's first year to second year. So why don't we talk about Guerrilla Games, for example? They released Horizon Zero Dawn in 2017, and then the later half of 2017 they released a semi-substantial but also semi-minor DLC in the Frozen Wilds. So they are certainly working on some new projects, and the current timeline of what they're doing right now is that they're waiting to move into a new studio in late 2019, actually. So they're in the process of nearly doubling their staff, more or less, to work on 2 projects. One is presumably to work on a sequel to Horizon, and another is likely to work on a new IP. Now, given their goal is to release games every 2 to 3 years instead of 4 to 5 years, and Horizon being a 2017 release, we could see their next game be a headlining title on PlayStation 5 in 2020, maybe 2021. But of course, that's largely dependent on a number of factors. How far along are they? If they're just using previous assets from their previous game, certainly. So if they're doing another Killzone, they've got plenty of assets. If they're doing another Horizon, again, plenty of assets. If they're doing new IP, that might take much longer, and that might be a situation where they need that doubling of staff to be complete, that new studio to be moved into, and them fully accommodated in late 2019. So we really might not see that project for quite a while, up until maybe 2022, 2023. Again, this is all very long term, but they do want to also release projects in a much more timely manner. Now, a more interesting project is probably that San Diego title that we really don't know much about. We just have a number of job listings trying to piece together what's really going on, and it's some sort of collaborative experience with Naughty Dog. So if you don't know, here's a quick rumor roundup. There's a handful of job listings more or less confirming that Sony is forming a new development team in San Diego, and that's currently working in conjunction with the Visual Arts Service Group. And this is the same group that worked on games like Uncharted, God of War, Death Stranding, major Sony IPs certainly. And the job listings themselves and the LinkedIn profiles suggest that this new studio is working very closely with an existing Sony studio, which, if you cross-reference it with another listing, you'll find that it's Naughty Dog and Santa Monica. So there you go. We pretty much more or less confirmed it's a very big AAA game. It's with Naughty Dog. Now, many people feel that this is a new Uncharted game from a purpose-built studio. That way, Naughty Dog can pursue other ventures outside of Uncharted. I'd have to imagine that after they ship The Last of Us Part 2, they might want to try a new IP on PlayStation 5. They're a very creative group. They have many ideas floating around. They have a sci-fi project that they once were about to start up at one point but scrapped. So they probably do want to move away from Uncharted and certainly don't want to try and do that. So that's certainly a possibility given that they're working with Naughty Dog. But it could be a number of other things. They could be using the engine. They could be using help from the ICE team. It could be a number of things, right? So it could also be a new IP. And something like PlayStation 5 needs a new IP here or there, right? And so obviously Sony's developers are working on their own new IP in relation to existing projects and entities that they own, but this could be a purpose-built studio for a new IP as well. Now, Polyphony Digital is kind of an open and shut case. I mean, they shipped Gran Turismo Sport in 2017. All they do is Gran Turismo games. They have offices all around the world working on Gran Turismo, whether that's supporting an existing title or working on a new one, and they're certainly well along in the next title. The studio head Kazunori Yamauchi is very forward about that. He's on a few occasions said, yes, we're working on the next Gran Turismo. He was a little upset that he didn't get to name GT Sport a proper GT7 or didn't release a proper GT7 on PlayStation 4. So we're not going to see another PlayStation 4 game from them, certainly, or at least I would assume so. We could very much so possibly see a very end-of-life cycle PS4 release. I mean, GT6 just did launch on PS3 very, very late into that life cycle, so it's not outside the realms of impossibility. But you assume that they are working on a proper GT7 on PlayStation 5. It's just more a question of how timely are they going to release this game. Now, given they're on x86 now, you've got all these assets that they've got. Again, they've got studios everywhere. You'd hope they'd get their shit together and release GT7 alongside PS5 or within the first year of PS5, but essentially that's kind of where we have to leave Polyphony for now. Moving on to Santa Monica Studio, they shipped God of War in 2018. Now, they're in the spot where they're definitely not going to release another PS4 game, but they're also too close to PS5 to where you're not even going to see their first PS5 project within the first year to 2 years. But what you have to remember is that you might see an announcement of their game within those 2 years, because that's the kind of big caveat to this conversation, is that all these games, some of them may release in the first 2 years, but we also have to get games announced and just shown off, right? A reason to buy into the platform, right? Games don't just get announced and come out right then and there. Some do, but not big major AAA titles. And so that's why, if you remember at the beginning of the video, those few developers I talked about, Naughty Dog, Sucker Punch, Media Molecule, Sony Bend, those are the developers where you're definitely not going to see anything from them within those first 2 years. You might get a teaser at the most, but you're not going to see anything substantial because they're still wrapping up their PS4 games. So they need a lot of development time. They're going to be in a cycle of beyond 2 years of PlayStation 5 to where you'd see their games. But these developers, you might see their games release or announcements. And Santa Monica is a big studio, so they're probably working on another God of War. And that's a game where you'll get announced with PlayStation 5 alongside. Who knows when they'll announce it, certainly, but that'll be a reason, right? Oh, that's a reason to buy a PlayStation 5 alongside X, Y, and Z, which may be the other developers that we're about to talk about. So now let's get into PlayStation VR, because as it stands right now, Sony has 3 developers working on PlayStation VR games: Manchester Studio, London Studio, and Japan Studio. And from the rumors we know, PS5 will absolutely feature a next-generation version of PlayStation VR, so it stands to reason that we'll be going into next-gen VR with heavy support from Sony. And this is perhaps the toughest portion to speculate on, because we don't have any idea in terms of when Sony will announce VR with PS5, if it will be day and date, or if VR will launch a year after PS5, and so forth. But at the very least, looking at today, we know that Sony is not letting the medium go, and they're only looking to improve upon it further. And then there's second-party developers like Insomniac and Sony just recently releasing Spider-Man on PS4, and that game saw incredible success, so you'd be pretty hard-pressed to think that they're not going to try and do something like that again. Sony and Marvel are going to want to do this again, and so you could probably expect a sequel on PlayStation 5. Insomniac wrapped up Spider-Man not that long ago, so we might see a trailer announcement at some point within those first 2 years, assuming that Insomniac does follow through with doing another sequel with Sony. Now, Quantic Dream has had a long history with Sony, and while Quantic Dream has gone on record to say that they're not looking to get bought out, that doesn't mean we won't see them work closely with Sony. They're always on Sony stage demonstrating tech demos, so there's a good chance they'll be there when PS5 is revealed, which is only a precursor for whatever project they might already be underway on, which may once again have PlayStation exclusivity, but who knows, because again, that jumping off point from the Microsoft video was the aggression Microsoft is showing. Maybe they're courting other developers, and that is definitely a Microsoft move, is trying to court second-party Sony developers. They've done that before, and so it's not outside the realms of impossibility that they'll do it again. But then there's just general third-party support. Sure, there are developers that work on every machine, but Sony did an excellent job this generation with securing marketing rights or exclusive DLC or timed exclusivity, console exclusivity, tons of things like that were on PlayStation 4 this previous generation. They did a really good job, and so it certainly stands to reason that Sony's going to keep doing that with PlayStation 5. And lastly, there's the looming notion of market preference. I mean, Japan is pretty much a free market for Sony. Microsoft really has no business ever selling there. They do almost next to nothing. And granted, Japan has kind of moved away from consoles nowadays. That's still a few million consoles Sony will sell over the lifetime of the unit for next generation, so that certainly helps. There is also Europe, which typically always, in some way, shape, or form, depending on the market or country, Sony sells a 3-to-1 lead against a Microsoft console. That's just history. That doesn't guarantee anything, certainly, but that is something that we can sort of look at and sort of speculate on. But the comment I'm seeing a lot is that Sony's worst beat Microsoft's best, and that's in regards to the PS3 and 360 generation. And while that is true, I don't really find that to be a sound comment. If Microsoft had no place in the games industry, they would have been gone a long time ago. Things can change, and nothing is for certain, which is why I try to have fair and open discussions about these things. And honestly, Microsoft's recent strategy of unifying Windows and Xbox has also been a point of contention, just more so how it's somewhat polarizing. There's no need to buy an Xbox console, and I certainly see that viewpoint. And at the very least, that also could probably tell us that they may not be even concerned without selling Sony at this point, because they're just more concerned about selling software, whether that's on Xbox or PC, or just getting people into their ecosystem with, buying a game and it being available everywhere, or their streaming service that they're working on currently. They might be more concerned with that, or subscription numbers. We don't necessarily know just yet. That's maybe a little bit too premature to speculate on. But, and certainly I think they would love to sell more consoles than Sony, but just based on what they're doing right now, they are somewhat polarizing decisions, but they do seem to be going in a different direction. And so that could certainly be something entirely different based on the future of what Sony and Microsoft are trying to do and what they're trying to accomplish in the industry. But one thing is absolutely for certain. Sony should be watching Microsoft just as much as Microsoft should be watching Sony. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you haven't yet, subscribe for the best PlayStation news, reviews, and updates here on YouTube. That's it for me in this video, and I'll see you all in the next one. You take it easy.